And joining us now on the debate, in the nation's capital, Sheila Copps, former Deputy Prime Minister, Liberal Member of Parliament for Hamilton East. And here in studio, John Tory, former leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party, now host of The Live Drive on Newstalk 1010 Radio. And Sylvia Bashevkin, Principal of University College and Political Science Professor at the University of Toronto. And a reminder, we call these programs Your Agenda Thursdays because you can reach us via Twitter at twitter.com/theagenda or by email at theagenda@tvo.org. And our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is hosting a live chat on our Inside Agenda blog at tvo.org/theagenda. So please jump in and join the debate. And Sheila, it's good to see you there in the nation's capital again. John and Sylvia, nice to have you here in Toronto. We have a nice eclectic mix of experiences here. Sheila, many decades of elective office. John Tory, of course, some elective office, a lot of time in the back rooms as well as an advisor, and you from your academic perch. So we want to get a sense of how you would rate, Sheila, to you first, the level of civility in politics today. What do you think?
Well, I think that there's less opportunity in politics today for people to actually become friends. It's a much more frenetic pace. And think about in the olden days, you would actually go to Ottawa by train across the country, and now you're literally flying all over the country on a regular basis. And I think that the lack of friendship, particularly lack of time spent together in minority in a non-sort of election mode, creates tension, and it does create a sense of angst and anxiety between and among members of Parliament.
John, you've been in Conservative Party circles for 40 years. How would you rate the level of civility today compared to what you've known in the past?
I'd say about -4 on a scale of 1 to 10. No, I just think it's bad. And I think Sheila's point is well taken. I mean, there were, you hear today that they'll say, the politicians, when they're off on one of these traveling committees and they're sort of forced to have dinner with each other, not that they mind, but when they're in a circumstance where they do it, they have a better time chatting with one another, including about issues, but also social conversation. But I just think the general attitude that people bring who are elected when they're in the Parliament, in particular, or in front of the media, is unacceptable, and I think it's a disgrace, frankly, and I think it leads to bad government and to cynicism about politicians.
Sylvia.
Well, I don't think, Steve, we can actually separate civility in politics from civility in the general society. If we're looking to talk about politeness versus rudeness, about respect versus disrespect. I mean, one only has to try and cross a street in one of Canada's major cities to kind of get a sense of people's impatience with each other and the sense that we're, as Sheila pointed out, very hurried. But I also think there's a factor where people may feel when they're in politics now, it's just much more controlled, that the ability to be spontaneous and have friendships across party lines and to speak as they might believe is actually much more constrained than it used to be, just because we have far more centralized party leadership, I think, in opposition as well as government.
Sheila, I don't know if it was this way in your day, but I have occasionally been told that in, for example, the nation's capital today, things are so bad that if you are a member, or let's say an MP of one party, you really ought not to be seen, say, socializing late at night with, like, having dinner, having a drink late or something from an MP from another party, because somehow you're being disloyal by doing so.
Well, I think,
do you hear that?
I think that's true, and I think part of the difference, I mean, Sylvia's right that it's partly a reflection of society at large, but the other thing is when you're in a minority parliament, you're always on a cliff's edge, and at any given time, an election could be triggered or a calamitous event could cause you to lose your job, forced upon you by the guy that you're having dinner with. So there's the reality of what it's like in minority, and you don't have the same liberties of knowing the time frame that you're going to be sitting in Parliament for 4 years. So every week you're kind of on a knife's edge, and I think that contributes to it. I think the other thing that contributes to it is it's very difficult to speak freely when sound bites get carried across the country by Twitter within 2 seconds of somebody saying something dumb. So it may be out of context, and it may make you look stupid, and I think it's a lot easier to do that today than it was 20 years ago, so people are a lot more cautious about what they say.
We've already seen the comments from our viewers come up on the screen, and somebody, John, just wrote in saying, why would anybody want to run for public life when you know, as Sheila just said, the second you say something maybe a little off, you're going to be crucified by the media. How big a part is that in it?
Well, I think the media has played a part. Instant news, competition for news has played a big part in kind of people feeling both that they have to say something sensational to get on the news, and also, you know, people perhaps speaking more quickly off the mark because they have to. You know, you respond instantly. But look, we're also making a lot of excuses here for what is a basic lack of self-discipline sometimes, because in the end, Chris Bentley made a great speech on a debate that I sponsored in the legislature when I was there.
Attorney General today.
Yes, he is, of Ontario. And he said, how is it that in court, and I've remembered it always because I thought it was such a good point. In court, which there's no more adversarial place where you're fighting harder for the views of your client and their position. And yet, who would ever think of going in there and shouting and yelling at your opponent and so on? Why? Because the judge wouldn't let you do it.
The judge will throw you in jail. Well, they don't have that
why
in
do
the
we say in Parliament that it's any different?
But I mean, John, there are only two people in court, a protagonist and an antagonist. In Parliament, you have 300 and something people representing multiple political parties with multiple viewpoints. Naturally, there's going to be more of a cacophony in Parliament than there is in court.
Well, if people choose not to behave themselves, Sheila, but
it's not a question of behaving themselves. It's a question of a forum where your voice and your words are your sword. And in a courtroom, there's all kinds of decorum attached to convincing those voters.
Tell me this: what's the difference, though? If you said I agree, your words and your voice are your weapon or your sword or whatever, but why can't people just wait their turn to be heard? I mean, and speak one at a time and not engage in this three-ring circus that I think brings disrepute on the highest offices we have to elect people to.
Go ahead, Sylvia.
But John, people who are sort of deferential to others and who don't come across as aggressive and who aren't seemingly confident and assertive are seen as being highly ineffectual.
Well, I'll take the word confident out of that, Sheila, and say, Sylvia, rather, and say that I'm sitting here beside you as evidence of that, because I never heckled. I wasn't aggressive in the House. I mean, I asked questions that I thought were forceful and well thought through and proper, but the fact is I was deemed not to be aggressive enough, and I'm sitting here beside you as an ex-politician, partly because of that.
But
that's a sad commentary.
I'm not suggesting, but the case that it's very difficult to succeed with good manners.
Well, so do we just accept that and sort of move on and say that's the way it'll be?
Well, I think it's not just good manners. It's also, if you look at the core issues, I think civility also comes with building personal relationships. And in different old parliaments, in former parliaments, I mean, I get a Christmas card. People are going to be shocked, but I get a Christmas card every year from John Crosby with his whole family. And of course, when we were in Parliament, we had this wonderful, set to. But we knew each other as people, and I think nowadays, because of the nature of the game getting that much more rapid and that much more fragmented, people really don't know each other. So there's a lot of visceral feelings out there that could be tantamount to hate, and that's what brings on the not just bad manners, but plain ugly accusations and counter-accusations.
John, let me follow up with you on something you just said a second ago, because I mean, I remember well when you were in public life, you tried, as the leader of the PC party, to bring in a kind of a code of civility. You campaigned on it. I wonder how much appetite there was even in your own caucus to follow that kind of... None. Zero. It was a non-starter, eh?
No, I mean, when I sort of said to them, look, I really appreciate it if you wouldn't just embarrass me completely when I'm in there saying I will not heckle. I sat in the legislature the whole time, never heckled once, because I just said, I'm not there to do that. I wouldn't have done it at the supper table with my family when I was a kid. I wouldn't have let my own kids do it. It wouldn't happen in a classroom, so why would I do it in the legislature, which I consider the highest calling you can have? But I mean, it was a dismal failure, because I think I was the only guy that was interested in my own code.
You and I are so different, because when I was in high school, I loved to heckle. I actually learned it. In the education system, and I think there are lots of kids.
No, but I think there is something a bit gendered about it, because when Sheila did heckle, she was constantly referred to with adjectives that suggested people were uncomfortable with a woman being as assertive as Sheila was in the House of Commons, right? So we heard about shrill and strident. Now, a woman who had more of John's approach, who was, I think if you look at the media clips, for example, of Audrey McLaughlin, you can see a woman, former New Democratic leader, first woman leader of a major federal party on the center left. She came from a social work background, and we all know that that's a profession where we value consensus building and people being gentle with each other, and it's generally not a field that attracts a sort of type A, go for broke, zero sum. And so as a result, if you see, for example, the 93 debates, the federal debates, leaders debates, very little coverage of Audrey McLaughlin. She's largely seen as ineffectual, not there, absent. Her own media people were quite critical of her performance because she wasn't pushy enough, really, to insert herself in the debate. So I think it's a very difficult circumstance. And as John says, it's hard for men. It's particularly hard for women to sort of break with that norm of being properly feminine.
And I think more so than the press, Steve, people always say, oh, no one runs for public office because of the press. I think that's rubbish. I felt fairly treated 99 days out of 100, 99.9 days out of 100 by the press. The part I think scares far more people off running for public office is that you'd have to actually learn to somehow go and participate in that kind of a circus. And a lot of people just say, why would I want to do that? I'm going there to try and get something done for the public. And if you can't learn how to be in that, that sort of environment, then you don't succeed nowadays. And if we're prepared to just give up and say that's the way it is, well, then I think things really are quite hopeless.
Let me see if we can figure out also whether this is another angle to blame. Sheila, they put television cameras in the House of Commons in 1977. They put television cameras in Queen's Park in 1985. Question period suddenly became, theater that everybody could watch all the time. Did that change people's behavior?
I think it was the start, but the thing is, Parliament is about a lot more than question period, and you don't get the good clips unless you make the 5-second or the 10-second soundbite. That's the reality of it. There are some expert parliamentarians, and it's funny, when I was in Parliament and I worked on with a couple of committees, we got so many bills through unanimously with all political parties, but very little attention was paid to them because there was agreement. So on the one hand, we say that we want people to get along and coalesce, but when we do coalesce and get along, there's no reporting. So the role of the media in exposing bad language is probably just as, like, it promotes it in the same way as the 15-minute news turnover now promotes people chasing rumors rather than fact. We're living in a much faster world, and the role of the media does encourage people to sometimes go over the top.
Let me give you a story that proves your point, though. Rogers Cable, where I used to work, they had a decision at one point in time years ago that they had to turn off the live coverage of City Council at 6 o'clock because they had other programming. The city councillors told me the level of behavior, the efficiency of the council meeting dramatically improved after the cameras were turned off than before. Now, you'd think it would be the opposite. When the camera's on, you're going to behave your best because people are watching. No, the behavior was a 3-ring circus. People behaved badly. Nothing got done because everybody went on and on.
More
cameras went off at 6 o'clock. Behavior improved, efficiency improved, meeting went well, end of meeting.
Did you find that at Queen's, because they put the cameras in Queen's Park in '85,
yes.
and you were there before that.
Yeah.
Did you find people grandstanded more when
Much
they put
more.
They did,
I mean, sure, it's show business now. I mean, and that's what it is. And show business isn't all bad, but they're there to do the people's work, and if it turns into entirely show business, or largely so, Sheila's right. The debates that happen when the cameras are still on but nobody's watching because it's not question period are actually far more thoughtful and sensible, and far less invective is hurled and insults are thrown. It's better.
But I mean, the challenge, though, is that if you are, let's say, in a consensus position, as we were, for example, when we brought in legislation to stop development in all the national parks, we had the Reform Party on side. We had every political party on side. It was a great piece of legislation, but it was passed virtually unnoticed because there was no fight. You almost need an antagonist and a protagonist to set the stage for good media coverage.
For what is newsworthy.
What a beautiful segue. Stand by, everybody. This is a beautiful segue, antagonist and protagonist, because I think, Sheila, if Brian Mulroney were here on this program tonight, he would point to a certain group of MPs called the Rat Pack back in 1984 and say, this is when civility started to disappear from public life. He might not be right, but I bet he'd say it. And
well, he could talk about the bell ringers, too, but that goes back even earlier.
That's
to
true.
His party.
I want to show a piece of tape here. And Sheila will get you to comment on it afterwards. I think you pretty well remember this. It's 1986. Sinclair Stevens, then Tory cabinet minister, is at the center of a bit of a storm because there are members of a committee investigating whether he was guilty of being in a conflict of interest. And, well, let's just let the tape speak for itself. Roll it, please, Michael.
All politicians are not crooks, unlike the minister who refuses to clear his name. Now speak out! You used the police connection in order to take a benefit for your position as a minister. You and the minister both, a bunch of hired guns.
She just had too much coffee.
Is that what it was? A quarter century later, Sheila, do you have any regrets about how you performed that day?
Well, what's interesting, Sylvia pointed earlier about the different treatment between men and women. The news that night called it Hockey Night in Canada. There were 4 men involved in the same altercation, including a minister who actually had me by a throat lock, whom I probably could have charged with assault.
Who was it?
And nothing was reported. Andre Bissonnette. He was kind of the point man for the minister to get him out of the committee before they answered the questions. And he had me up against the wall in a headlock. And a reporter came to me and said, I'll get you the tape if you want. You've got grounds for an assault. And I said, oh, forget it. Let's just drop it. But all the news pointed to me jumping over tables, which I actually incidentally did not do. I crossed by chairs. And nobody in any party other than myself really, it didn't stick in anybody's mental sort of memory other than the picture of me, because my high voice was screaming and I was being aggressive.
But who was yelling at you, not yelling at you, but who was in the background saying, Sheila, Sheila? Somebody...
That was Marcel Prudhomme, who is an independent, was at the time he was a Liberal, and he's now an independent, or he became an independent senator. John Nunziata was involved, St. Stephen's was involved, as well as Andre Bissonnette, and they had a bit of a wedge team. They had moved the committee to a very small room so that they could get in and get out quickly. And so I scampered around the chairs to actually get the minister as he's walking through the door, and that's when Andre Bissonnette got me in the headlock.
I never knew that.
They ran off. He ran off. Poor Andre Bissonnette. St. Stephen's jumped in his limo and left Andre Bissonnette out on the street running around. I mean, it was a melee, but the melee was going all the way around. And what people remember is me supposedly jumping on tables.
Okay, well, let's acknowledge then the double standard in the coverage, which wouldn't be the first time and certainly won't be the last time. But Sylvia, as you look at that tape all these years later, what do you see?
Well, I see a substantive question being asked by an opposition MP in a very small caucus facing a very large majority government.
And we should remember there were 211 Conservatives then.
And it was a tiny Liberal
40
caucus,
Liberals.
Very small Liberal caucus. I mean, the point about the Rat Pack I think we have to understand is, look, it's an opposition party doing its job, or part of the opposition party doing its job to actually raise questions and leave, no doubt in the minds of Canadians that there is a majority government being held to account. There was no question asked about, the appearance of the minister, the voice of the minister, the personal life of the minister. I mean, this was a serious question that an opposition MP was asking. I think so much of the deterioration that Canadians are frustrated about is the lack of focus on substantive questions, whether it's about the behavior of a minister or policy directions of a government, or why is this document so blacked out that we actually can't understand what's in it.
Let me get John's view on the Rat Pack back in 1984.
Well, I see that event as just one on a long, slow decline down, so that's just one event at one point in time. And I think it's even worse today, because what you've got added to it today, I think, is an incredible polarization in politics that has less to do with behavior and more to do with attitude. And I think they're incapable now. I mean, I interviewed Ralph Goodale today, the Liberal MP from Saskatchewan, former finance minister.
For your radio show.
Yeah, I did. And I said to him, why did we have a week and a half or 2 weeks on Helena Georges and so forth? And I did a story yesterday on youth unemployment and all the people in the country that are losing hope, kids that can't find a job, and there's not been a word said in Parliament about them. No, I mean, not as far as you hear. I mean, that they're onto this other stuff. And that's part of this sort of polarization, character assassination that now, as Sheila said earlier, has become kind of the tool set that you use, and the notion that somebody might actually ask about one of the real issues. I think it also has to do, Steve, with the diminished role of MPs. I think some of them feel they have to get up and engage in this stuff because there's nothing else left for them to do because of that centralization of party leadership and so on, where there isn't a role for them. They're sort of stuffed pigeons that get up and do what they're told, and that's kind of it. And I really regret that too.
But when you do, for example, let's look at the issue of employment or the issue of unemployment. The reality is that when you talk about a fake lake, it gets a lot of coverage.
Yeah.
And if you're a member of Parliament, part of your job is to let your constituents know that you're out there fighting for them. If you talk about the level of unemployment in your riding or across the country or across demographic sectors, nobody covers it.
I agree.
So the reality is that an MP who's trying to get their message out has to come in with very tight, short sound bites that simplify any issue to its lowest grain of civility, and it's becoming more and more so because we do have the 15-minute news cycle where every 15 minutes something interesting has to be said and something new has to be said, and that's how the vicious beast of public information gets out.
Let's go back almost 10 years exactly. The players, they're in somewhat different positions here. Mike Harris is the Premier of the day. Dalton McGuinty is the opposition leader of the day. This is a moment in question period. I want to play a piece of tape here. The Premier of the day is referring to the late father of the opposition leader of the day, and here's how it all rolled out. Roll tape, please.
I can see why you're not up to speed. I mean, if you only work a one-day week, it's pretty hard to stay up to speed on this stuff. But let me tell you what the ORC recently said. The ORC...
Member, take a seat. Order. I have to say this. I think your father would be embarrassed to see you stand here day after day after day in the gutter, ruining the reputation of your father and your... Order.
Okay, Sylvia, you see that. There's kind of an unwritten rule in politics, I think, that families are off limits, but families weren't off limits that day. What do you read into that?
Well, I read something of a crossing of boundaries by both actors.
By both actors?
Yes.
How did Mr. McGuinty cross the boundary?
Well, I mean, to some degree by, casting aspersions on the extent to which someone pays attention to their work.
So this shot about you only work 1 day a week.
That is, I think there are other ways to talk about the extent to which someone knows their portfolio or doesn't know their portfolio, which is to point out factual errors, for example, or absence from, a given session, or instead of that sort of
so he had it coming?
What could have been seen as a cheap shot. Well, I'm not sure that that the two wrongs make a right. But it seems to me that the response, by the premier of the day was somewhat patronizing. In other words, I knew your father and you're no, senior Mr. McGuinty.
Right.
So, I'm not sure that those sorts of interchanges, first of all, even seen by the general public for the most part, because we have to remember there was a time when people read Hansard. Right? They read the exchange in Parliament, and so it's a little different to actually go through a text than to see this sort of back and forth.
But I'm not sure these dots are connected.
I don't think that this is terribly edifying as a debate.
Well, it isn't. I mean, these dots are connected, though, because as Sheila said earlier, the lot of an opposition leader, of which I've been one, it's a terrible job, and Michael Ignatieff's going through that now, is that if you don't sometimes engage in that kind of, whatever you want to call it, exaggerated accusation or whatever, you don't get any coverage. Because I can tell you, having faced Dalton McGuinty as Premier when I was the opposition leader, he treated me most of the time respectfully. He didn't answer any of my questions, but he was not disrespectful, once or twice I might have said. But so there's a man in one job who was kind of conducting himself one way, but as Premier, I would say in the House, I felt he was respectful of the process, didn't heckle, didn't get up and do name calling. And so...
What do you think of Mike Harris's shot, raising the issue of McGuinty's late father?
I thought it was him taking the bait, which I think, the ones that you watch that are good at being Premier, the Bill Davises, I think even David Peterson was this way, and Dalton McGuinty, they don't take the bait. They just let it roll off them, and they get up and sort of say, well, clearly you don't understand, or something, which sort of says, look, I know what I'm doing over here, and you don't, you're up making these wild accusations, and I'm not getting flustered. And Mike Harris took the bait that day and, gave him what's for, which probably wasn't the right thing for him to do, for a number of reasons.
Sheila, you know from firsthand that families haven't always been off limits in the House of Commons or on the legislature floor, right? How did you deal with it?
Well, I think John's right. When you're in opposition, you love to get the Prime Minister on his feet in a fashion where he's going to make himself look bad. And when you're the Prime Minister, the smartest thing to do is let your ministers handle it.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder, in the current circumstance at the federal level, why the Prime Minister seems to be engaged on just about every file, because there are lots of files where it's sort of nice to have some distance between you and a potential problem.
Should Mike Harris have raised Dalton McGuinty Sr. in giving the answer to Dalton McGuinty Jr.?
No, obviously. And I mean, when your parent is no longer in Parliament, but not only that, he's deceased and he's replaced him. Invoking his dead father was in extremely poor taste, and probably the moment that it came out of his mouth he realized it. But he was prodded and he responded, and that's part of the job of people in question period, is to get to the nub of somebody's thinking and maybe cut through the veil of what they don't think they want to say, and that's when you get the sound bites.
Now, is it my imagination, John, or did that just kind of not happen 25, 35 years ago? Would you have taken a shot at somebody's family like that?
I don't think so. I mean, Sheila was there. I left there 25 years ago as an advisor to Mr. Davis, but that's a previous era, and Sheila was there. I mean, there was lots of spirited debate. There was some degree of, of not so much of the name calling, and I don't think there was the same degree of sort of character assassination. Now, it seems like you really haven't done the job, or you haven't really tried to do the job, unless you really try and finish the person off and leave them lying on the floor with 3 knives sticking out of them, and they're clearly dead.
But some of the repartee T was also actually more intelligent.
Oh,
People
much
were better
funnier and
wordsmiths.
clever. It was clever then, Sheila. I agree with you.
You know, we just got an email about that we put up on the screen a few moments ago, which said, we don't mind heckling. It's the lack of wit that really bothers us.
It's character
It's
assassination.
imagination, it's creativity, it's knowledge of the issues, it's the ability to actually take this all back to the fabric of democracy concerns.
A guy like Jim Bradley,
citizens
Sheila was there when Jim was there, and he's actually quite funny when he heckles. You know, so when he would heckle, even when I was there, I'd have to smile, even though I don't think the heckling is a good thing, the way it gets carried. But there's people like that, and then there's others that are just sort of crude, and you just sort of...
And mean, and some are mean.
Exactly. That's the part that bothers me more than crude.
The meanness quotient is going up.
Big time.
Because I don't think people see each other as kind of friends.
Well, tell me if you think this.
lines.
Tell me if you think this fits into this category. I'll let this email just go across the screen here. Our politicians simply reflect our own disconnect and our own petulance. Okay, we've heard that. You made that point, Sylvia, at the beginning of the program. But Michael, if we can, let's go to the bottom of page 4 here and play. This is a very recent exchange. I've played 2 old clips right now. Let's go for this recent exchange where the guy who was voted the Parliamentarian of the Year, John Baird, was before a committee of the House of Commons just a couple of weeks, or was it last week? Last week. And here's what happened. Roll tape.
I appreciate that it only took me, 50 times to be able to ask to be heard.
Good, bye. Okay. Are you trying to intimidate me, Minister Baird? Don't try and intimidate me, ever.
Let's not make it into a school of grade 5 playing across from each other.
Okay, John, when members of the public who perhaps don't like the theater and don't like the politics of it as much as other people do, when they see that, what do you think they think?
I think they think those people up there are wasting time, wasting their money, not addressing the issues they really care about, which may be things, and I take Sheila's point entirely about what gets you on TV and what doesn't, but if you said, well, are you worried about your kids not being able to find a job, as opposed to whatever that was all about in terms of, really it was about the aides not testifying and so on, but it was something totally extraneous to anything that meant anything. I think they just are frustrated by it and say, these are the idiots. We thought we elected sensible people, we made a choice, and this is how they behave, and this is why I'm fed up with the whole thing. That's what I think they think.
Sheila, what do you infer from that?
Well, that was a pretty ugly session, but the original script that you brought forward, the original posting from 25 years ago from the Rat Pack, sometimes governments and oppositions clash in parliamentary committee in a very intense way because there are some intense issues at stake. And in that case, there was an intense issue. If a parliamentary committee seeks to hear from a witness, they expect to hear from the witness. So there was a deliberate attempt on the part of John Baird to replace a convened witness. On the surface of it, the whole thing looks bad and everybody walks away with egg on their face, but there are some substantive principles underlying why a committee is a good place to actually have that debate. Because if you don't have that kind of a debate, if a committee doesn't have the power and the authority to independently call witnesses, then you can't talk about members of parliament having no power, because this one little power that they have is now being taken away.
Okay, we're going to just take a minute and a half out of our debate for a second here, because Mike Miner is watching what's going on online right now. And Mike, come on in here and tell us what folks are saying on our website.
Well, this conversation started off earlier yesterday when we first started talking about it on some of our social media platforms. Timothy from London, Ontario got on and asked when we ever had civility in politics. Must have been before his time. He is a grown-up. John Coppola is watching from Buffalo, and he says, you have to be kidding. Here in the U.S. we have teabaggers, birthers, Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, and Sarah Palin. And they say they look to us for guidance, specifically TVO, but I'm sure he means Canada in general. Mr. Tory brought up television and how the cameras changed the discourse. Well, we have Jeff Jedras, who writes the Partisan blog at BC here in Toronto. It's a very liberal blog. And he says that the blogosphere might be a little bit rougher. He certainly checks himself when he appears on television in a way that he wouldn't online. But all of these bloggers and all of these people in these parties, they socialize in Ottawa all the time. But he does point out that this uncivil behavior is rewarded. He was a Stéphane Dion supporter, and he watched his guy get worked over thoroughly, and he thinks it's probably the same sort of thing where the women say they want a nice guy but go home with the jerk. That cliche is probably truer when you apply it to politicians.
Okay, stand by, keep moderating, and we'll go back to you just before the top of the clock tonight. I want to pick up on one thing Mike said, and I could not believe this as I watched this the other night, a YouTube clip. They had a gubernatorial debate in South Carolina. And the first question out of the moderator's mouth was to a female candidate who actually ended up winning. her party's nomination. And John, the question was, can you confirm or deny the rumors we have heard about you that you've had 2 extramarital affairs? First question of the night. We're not there yet, are we? If we want to talk civility, we're not there yet.
I hope not, because, you know, in the end, but that is a function, I think, of either the host, moderator, or the TV network, or somebody thinking they've got to prove a point. I mean, I suppose if this woman had made an issue of her family life, or if she'd made an issue of her values and that she was a kind of a, you know, then even then I'd sort of say, well, that seems like of all the questions you could ask first, which I assume might be the top most important question, that's it.
But I mean, but what about Adam Giambroni?
Well, in what respect, Sheila?
Well, I didn't know the man from Adam, and the first thing that I heard about him was when he pulled out of the potential for being a candidate because of an allegation about some kind of an affair.
Oh yeah,
and that was widely covered in Toronto.
Oh sure, and the problem was he had not told the truth when asked about this. I think
but my only point was, I think we're being somewhat disingenuous if we assume that people's private lives are always off limits. They tend to be off limits
not
in
anymore.
Parliaments. They're certainly not off limits at City Hall.
Absolutely not. You're right.
There was in the South Carolina case, there was no evidence anywhere. It was all it was all just kind of a slam job by her opponents. With Giambroni, I mean, they had text messages. They had him.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it. I'm just saying that for that was the biggest news that hit Ottawa about the City Hall race in Toronto.
Yeah.
And it was all about the sex.
What a statement that is.
Well, so that's what people were talking about. I don't know anything about who did what to whom, but I'm just saying that got huge coverage across the country. And the other elements of the race, and if it's transportation or who the candidates, et cetera, have been very low key.
Okay, if you could let's do this. Forgive me, Larry, how am I doing on time here? We got 2 minutes? 2.5 minutes to go. Let's go briefly around the horn here. If you could change one thing to make politics more civil, what would you do? Sylvia, go first.
Well, probably do something about the centralization of party control by leaders, and
that
probably
contributes to it?
I think people don't have any sense that they have any oxygen anymore. It's all scripted for them, and so in order to actually have any reputation, they have to kind of go out on a limb in some respects with behavior or statements. But also, I think we should think about the tie between the electoral system and behavior, because, you know, in political systems that do have more coalition government and so on, there is much more of a willingness to work across party lines to build governments.
Make sure I got time for everybody. Sheila, go ahead, your turn.
I would get parliamentary committees the right to initiate legislation. And I tell you, that would change the face of Parliament. It would also balance the power structures.
How so?
Because if you're a parliamentarian and you can bring forth a bill that becomes law through your committee, you work with people.
Okay. John Tory, you get the last minute.
I would use parliamentary committees that are equal in representation to deal with special issues, like if you had, whether it's pensions or some of the big issues that need to be addressed, and say we'll have 3, 3, and 3, and don't bring us back any dissenting reports. We want you to focus on the things you can agree on, and I would have consequences for bad behavior in the House of Commons, not just hackling once in a while, but I'm talking about the people who go in and abuse their privileges. I would say there's got to be consequences for that, so that then people stop behaving that way.
You think that would work?
Well, I mean, sure, it would. It works everywhere else. I mean, if your kids behave badly and you do nothing about it, they keep behaving that way. But when you send them to the room and ground them for a month, they tend to stop. I mean, and if they have to be treated like children in that way, well then fine, let's do that rather than let it go on.
Okay, we're going to have more on this coming up. Michael Chong, who's a member of Parliament from the Conservative Caucus in Ottawa, has got some ideas about how to improve question period. So just before we get to that interview, let me say to Sheila Copps in the nation's capital, thank you for being there on the line for us.
Thank you, Steve.
They ever going to get that Hamilton Stadium figured out, Sheila? I don't know. We'll get on to that next time. John Tory's going to tell us. John Tory's going to tell us in our last 5 seconds whether he's really not running for mayor of Toronto.
Never mind.
He's really not running for mayor of Toronto.
Is that a question or a statement?
That is a question.
I see. Well, you know, I said when I said I wasn't running in January that you never say never, because that would be unwise in politics, wouldn't it now? But I have no plans to have any plans to have a campaign.
Oh my God, John, you're leaving the door open, aren't you?
I have no plans to have any plans to have a campaign.
That's what Bill Davis said.
Is that what Bill Davis said?
That's
exactly.
You need a sex scandal to get your information out there.
Yeah, don't wait for that, Sheila.
Oh boy, I'm thinking Michael Chong may just have to go to the side here as I start to grill you on whether you're going in or not. He didn't turn it down. You're thinking about this, aren't you?
Well, you know what? A lot of people still speak to me in the street. I walked in the studio and somebody spoke to me about it. But I'm busy being a talk show host and being the head of the City Summit Alliance and fully engaged in those
He has no plans. Okay, Sylvia, thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.